We're going to hear from an author, Donna Jackson Nakazawa. And Donna has written this book. How many have heard of it? It's called The Autoimmune Epidemic. And Donna has been a journalist for much of her life and got Guillain-Barré syndrome, which we talked about a little bit this morning, which is a one-time autoimmune attack of the peripheral nerves, and recovered and went back to her life and raising her kids, and then in 2005 was struck again with Guillain-Barré, something which really isn't supposed to happen. And so while she was convalescing from her second attack of Guillain-Barré, she, as a journalist, decided to begin to investigate autoimmunity and really started to research what became this book, The Autoimmune Epidemic, which is, I think, a very provocative book which talks about environmental triggers for autoimmunity. And the full title of the book is, well, it's The Autoimmune Epidemic, but it's Bodies Gone Haywire in a World Out of Balance and the Cutting-Edge Science That Promises Hope. And it talks about the myriad of environmental, chemical, and biological things to which we are exposed now, which may be contributing to autoimmunity. And the central premise is that the rate of most, if not all, autoimmune diseases is rising consistently decade by decade from the 1950s on. And so in the book, she talks at length about whether this could simply be diagnosis, that we're getting better at diagnosing them. And it's pretty clear that that's not the case, that it's not just a diagnosis bias, but that the true incidence of these diseases is increasing. And she tries to then figure out, or at least propose some ideas as to why that might be the case. And one of the things that she comes up with is that there are a series of chemicals to which we are exposed which may alter the ability of the immune system to effectively discriminate between foreign infections and your own body. And she goes into some great detail about what those are. And so I read the book, and I was very intrigued by it, in that I don't think it is definitive, but it is very provocative. And as you read the book, I think you are, or I was, amazed by how scholarly it was. There are 700 or 800 references in this book, references to the medical literature which discuss how chemical triggers, and there are certain chemicals that do this, have been looked at and can actually induce autoimmunity in animals. And how, for example, blood specimens have been taken from humans, normal people, and from newborn babies and analyzed for certain chemical compounds which are known to increase the risk of autoimmunity, and they are found at startlingly high rates. So you've got 2 points. One is that autoimmunity is increasing. 2 is that we have an increasing burden of chemical, viral, and biological things in our bodies. And it is tempting to then link the two causally and to say, well, okay, the chemicals are causing the increased autoimmunity, and that has not been shown. And the other side of this coin is, well, you haven't really shown that at doses found in humans, in many of these cases, that it can trigger autoimmunity. We're kind of left with animal models and that type of thing. But nonetheless, very provocative. And so as you read the book, you feel for a while like, oh man, these things are all over. I mean, what am I going to do? But then you find out, and she will talk about to you by satellite, about ways to understand this and to really take charge of this, maybe even before the jury is in, maybe even before we know for sure. There are things that each of us can do that can mitigate a risk of the things that may be causing autoimmune disease. And so I felt like it was a very empowering book. And so as you get toward the end, and so I encourage people get to the end, because it says, here are the things that a reasonable person can do without going crazy and living in a bubble and having watercress and that's it for the rest of your life. Things that a reasonable person can do to reduce the risk. And so she's going to talk about that tonight. She could not come for health reasons, and she wanted desperately to come. So Adam has worked very hard with Chris to get her by phone video hookup, and so hopefully we'll have her in a few minutes. So while we're still waiting for that, are there any thoughts or questions about today? People exhausted? You want me to bring in cookies and milk to everybody? So I'm happy to do that. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions relating to TM. I'm 82 years young.
You don't look 82 years old, first of all. Let's just start that, but go ahead.
And I was diagnosed 4 years ago. And my question is, since I understand that TM is inflammation of the spinal cord, how does our diet, the foods we eat, affect the inflammation? And are there foods considered anti-inflammatory?
Okay, so she's 82 and got transverse myelitis when she was 78. And the question is, are there dietary triggers or maybe even things that would protect from inflammation? And the answer is there's a lot that's unknown about this. It's one of the things that's the topic of this book, are things that we eat that can modulate autoimmunity. There is nothing, honestly, that can protect against transverse myelitis that you can take, but there are some things that we ask to be careful about, like echinacea, for example. Echinacea is an immune stimulant and may help you fight off colds, but it worries me that in an over-exuberant immune system, which is transverse myelitis, things like echinacea might worsen it. So there are things that I would say I would not take. Conversely, there are things like vitamin D deficiency and B12 deficiency, which are extremely common. And I would venture to say that many of you, if you checked your vitamin D level in your blood, that vitamin D level is too low. And this is really an epidemic, vitamin D deficiency. We have been amazed at how frequently that occurs. And it's another one of those things, well, okay, but maybe so what? Well, we're looking into that. But meanwhile, I think it is prudent to replace vitamin D to get that checked. What's that? So I think you want to get basic nutritional studies. You want to look at B12. You want to look at folate. You want to look at vitamin D. And do the best you can to restore a balance, but there's nothing that's going to kind of take this away or anything like that. Yes, ma'am. Is white sugar going to be a bad thing? I don't think there's any evidence that white sugar is going to be particularly bad for autoimmunity, not that I'm aware of. Is anybody? You are?
Well, the only thing that I know about is Dr. Strand saying that oxidative stress goes up when we're spiking our blood sugar, and white sugar would certainly do that. But also that suggesting that possibly a high alkaline diet helps reduce inflammation, or acid things like tobacco and wine and red meat and sugar and all of those kind of things tend to be supportive of inflammation, and alkaline diet helps too. So I don't know. That's just one person's opinion.
So that the comment was, and I'd encourage you to talk more about this with the mic. We're going to get to Donna in a second, but dietary things like meats and alcohols and tobaccos and things like that may actually encourage inflammation. Don't know that for sure, but it's one of those things that you may get from from this discussion, from the book, is there are certain things you can do and say, look, I don't know this for sure, but I'm going to do it. It may work for me. So is Donna available? Donna, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Hi.
Yay! Well, it is great to have you by satellite. We wish we could have you live, but we have already done an introduction, and so we figured you would talk for a while and tell us what you have to say. I've introduced the book and where you came from and a little bit about what happened to you and how you got into this. And
happy to do it.
What's that?
First, I just want to say thanks to Doug for having me because I'm just so sorry not to be there in person, but so grateful to you for including me in this event, and it's pretty exciting. The reason that I wrote the book is because I have a strong personal history with autoimmune disease. I've suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome several times, and it's just another rare neurological autoimmune disease, as you know. And it really took away a lot of my life as a mother of young children and a series of other autoimmune diseases, which is actually, as Doug knows, part of the reason I'm not traveling right now. So my frustration as a woman and as a mother and as a patient, and also my father died from autoimmune diseases when I was a child. So there were many reasons why I wanted to learn more about these diseases. One of the primary things that happened was as I was recovering from Guillain-Barré syndrome, I talked to some different scientists I knew because I'm a reporter, and they told me that they were very disturbed by the fact that rates of autoimmune diseases are going up and up. And there are 15 studies from around the world showing that rates of these diseases have been rising in the last 30 or 40 years. So as a journalist, but also as a mother, as a daughter, as a patient, this really concerned me, and I wanted to learn more about it. So I put my skills to it, and I tracked down some of the top scientists in the country who are specialists in these diseases. One of them is Doug. I followed him around his laboratory quite a bit and put him through an awful lot of questions until I really understood what he was doing. And what I came to find was a couple of things. One, I just want to say to everybody there, this is a tremendously exciting time in autoimmune disease research. We have people like Dr. Kerr who are standing at the vanguard of a whole new generation of science and scientists who are working so hard on behalf of the patients, really break the code, not only what's behind this epidemic, but how to stop it in its tracks. So I just want to say to patients that I think it's really, no one wants to have an autoimmune disease, but it's a really exciting time in autoimmune disease research. We're starting to understand more about what causes these diseases and what we can do about them. So some of what my research showed is that the things that are happening that are causing autoimmune disease research are multifactorial. We know that in the past 30, 40 years, 50 years really, our environment has changed a great deal. So there is certainly a great deal of research out there which indicates that we are exposed on a day-to-day basis to an awful lot of things that may be what I call autogenic to our immune system. Kind of like we have carcinogens that we relate to cancer. We have autogens that we might relate to autoimmune disease. And these autogens have increased in the industrial age and in the past 30 to 40 years as rates of autoimmune diseases have risen as well. So that's certainly one question, one factor that's being explored by scientists around the world. I can see that you all lost me on the screen. Should I keep talking? Can you still hear me? Okay. So one of the other things that we know has played into these diseases is a shift in the American diet, certainly. the American diet has changed drastically in the past 100 years. We went from kind of a whole foods diet that supported our bodies quite well to something much more like a processed food diet or foods that our body doesn't digest as easily. So there are a whole group of scientists working on this, gastroenterologists who work with rheumatoid arthritis patients, and there's some really exciting new data coming out which shows us that patients who are particularly put on a particularly whole foods diet rather than a processed foods diet are having more success in their treatment. So as I said, this is a really neat time in this field. We also are looking at the role of stress, you know, the work of so many people around the country like Esther Sternberg at NIH, who's really finding that stress is in a sense a chemical in our bodies and plays into this multifactorial set of things that are causing rates of autoimmune disease to double and triple. So we're looking at all those things, and then we have the exciting news that there are so many more things that scientists understand that we can do to ameliorate the attack of the immune system on the body. So I'm happy to take as many questions as people have. I think I'll just give you a few little statistics, which I think are particularly important. One is that a woman today, 1 in 9 women will have an autoimmune disease. That means that you are 8 times more likely to have an autoimmune disease than you are to have breast cancer. And yet, we find that the funding for autoimmune disease is 1/10 that of what we get for cancer. So one of my missions in writing this book was to try to bring a lot of national attention to this epidemic, which has been sort of underneath cancer, which is so important, of course, and underneath heart disease, which again is so important, but to bring it to the national level that those diseases are now at so that we can do more about it and get more funding for the important research that's going on. So I'm happy to take as many questions as you all have.
So the question, Donna, is for you personally, is there a diet which you are on, which you believe in, and which has helped you?
Well, absolutely. I just want to be clear, though, that I work with one of my specialists with diet and also some supplementation, things like vitamin D, which we know is so implicated in autoimmune disease. And I'm very careful to make sure that I run any kind of dietary changes or supplements through my doctors. But I do follow what you might think of as the anti-autoimmune diet. I write about it in the book. It's very similar to the anti-inflammatory diet, and it's something that I know several researchers are writing about right now. It avoids processed foods, it avoids gluten, and it focuses really on whole, natural foods. Kind of, some people tend to think of it as foods that were available in our grandparents' day. So a lot of vegetables, fruit, you know, any kind of lean fish or beef. Some people don't like to eat beef, but chicken, things like that, and fruits and vegetables. I cut out a lot of carbs and sugars and dairy and glutens and things like that. That is basically the anti-autoimmune diet. As I said, I've written a great deal about it. And
I don't know if that's just a transient thing. One of the things that she talks about in the book, which kind of made sense to me, is to become aware of the things that we use in our normal daily lives that are
Jackson DJ is no longer available. Jackson DJ is now available.
Potentially linked, and maybe not singly, but in combination to autoimmune diseases, and those are, you know, including the soaps we use, the detergents, the pesticides, the insecticides, the processed foods, and as you go through that book, what I thought was helpful is you make a list, and make a list of the things that you may be exposed to or your children may be exposed to, and those which you have to have, and those which maybe aren't that important, and as you become more aware of their potential role in autoimmunity, that you can do without or you can change. So, for example, she talks about organic foods, and the data saying that foods that have been grown with pesticides and insecticides, even after washing them, contain trace amounts of that, whereas organic foods have much lower amounts of those things. And certain detergents are just filled with things that modulate the activity of the immune system. And, you know, there are things that you can do to minimize those risks, and it's not going to be, I think, one specific thing or one specific dietary aspect, but in totality, the things that you can minimize will, I think, reduce risks. Did I do that right, Donna?
You are so right on. You could go around and give all my lectures for me. It absolutely is what I liken to the barrel effect. And by that, the worst thing to me would be if patients walked around full of fear that everything they put in their bodies, or every whiff of gasoline, or every detergent they come in contact with is going to lead to some terrible flare-up or demise. What it really is a barrel effect. It's as if our bodies are barrels and we can take so much, but at a certain point, it's too much for our immune systems. Our immune systems are there to defend us and do the right things, keep all the bad invaders away. But when our immune systems are overtaxed or that barrel is too full, we know from so much scientific data now that certain things can overstimulate the immune system. And as Doug pointed out when I was interviewing him, in many cases, we don't know about the combination of many different chemicals that are in our environment every day. And those combinations of chemicals may in of themselves be more harmful than just, say, one chemical alone. So, yet we can't look at this as if every time we turn around we're doing something terrible for ourselves. We live in a world that's full of things we can't control. We have to look at what we can control. And it's not a matter of emptying the barrel, it's a matter of just bringing down the level. So when you look at it that way, making safe and healthy choices, choosing organic foods, choosing detergents that don't have things in them, avoiding spraying your home with aerosol chemicals like, ant killers and things like that. These are just common sense choices. And we're living in a really neat time in which we have so many choices. You can clean green in your home. You can buy organic food. You can eat a whole food diet anywhere you live now because of the different things that are available in our supermarkets. So we can really make a lot of good choices and bring that barrel effect down in such a way that we're living a healthier life. And that's good for you whether you have an autoimmune disease or not.
Questions? Yeah. Paraffins, you said, right? Parabens?
Parabens.
I try to exclude that in my skincare products, but
should I just jump in on that? Parabens and phthalates are of concern because they are in most of our cosmetics in America. The European Union has decided to implement something called REACH, which basically puts the onus on chemical companies in Europe to prove that about 30,000 different chemicals are safe before they're used in the public domain. Here we really don't have anything like that. We have the release of 5 new chemicals a day, and we have 80,000 chemicals in the environment. And we don't really do immune system testing on those chemicals. One of the things that the European Union has also been ahead of us in addition to this kind of testing, is they have eliminated phthalates and parabens from cosmetics. What this means for cosmetic companies is that they have to actually run two plants. One plant will be for distribution in Europe, and the other is for Americans who are still buying parabens and phthalates. Parabens and phthalates are also what are known as endocrine disruptors. And NIH said 2 years ago that endocrine disruptors were a fascinating new area of research in autoimmune disease and in what's triggering autoimmune disease, because endocrine disruptors come into our bodies and they mess with our endocrine signals. They act kind of like missed signals. If we're a radio station and there is a receiver that's sending us signals, endocrine disruptors get in the way of the natural signals that should be sent in our hormonal system. And in so doing, because our hormonal system is so very important in our immune system, can be a factor in autoimmune disease. So many different endocrine disruptors are being studied now, probably the best of which, the best body of studies really is happening with pesticides, and they're also considered endocrine disruptors, as is BPA, the kind of plastic that we've been hearing so much about lately. Again, I don't want to give a laundry list to terrify people. You know, all of us are going to be drinking out of some plastic. All of us are going to have some cosmetics with parabens and phthalates in them. But the question is, can you make some choices to move away from that? There are 5 or 6 cosmetic companies now in America that do not use parabens and phthalates. They are moving away from that model for green reasons, but also because that's going to be where the consumer dollar is. So the more that we don't buy the products that have those things, the better. And I'll tell you confidentially, sort of, that a cosmetic company I'm not going to name did call me a few months ago and asked me what I thought their trajectory was on American women still buying phthalates and parabens. And I don't think it's that long. I think that people are waking up to this information and they want to bring down what's in their barrel. They may not be able to affect every change, but they want to make enough changes that they're healthier.
Other questions? Yes, sir. I'll answer that. That might be, you can answer it too. Preaching to the choir, I guess the implication would be, once you've had an autoimmune disease, it's too late. Why try to modify your environment? But to me, it makes a lot of sense and is very empowering to say, look, I'm not going to be a victim of this. I can control certain things in my environment. I don't know if I'm ever going to get a disease again, but I want to take that opportunity to control the things that I can to minimize that chance and improve my health. So I think this is the group to be talking to. In terms of her qualification, she's not a medical doctor, but she's an investigative journalist who really dug into this. And, you know, when I first started looking at it, you know, I said the same thing. You know, where is she going to be coming from? And you find out, first of all, that it's not from any commercial or corporate bias. It's from a personal journey that she's taken. And then you look at the hundreds and hundreds of medical documents and the references to this, and you say, you know what? That's pretty good. That's a pretty good qualification. Donna, do you want to say anything?
I'm asked all the time whether or not I'm a medical doctor, and I totally respect that question because, you know, certainly what I like to look at for all of my research is everything that's being done by people like Doug and literally dozens of other scientists whose work I followed very closely. But what I'd like to say is that often a journalist, an investigative journalist, needs to translate what's going on in science and make it available for the layperson. So I saw my job in doing this reporting for the years to stay very wedded to science, and every researcher I've worked with knows that not a word goes out to the public, but that they haven't checked off on it to make sure that everything that I'm saying is scientifically valid and backed up often, there's 700 endnotes in my book. So the data behind everything I've said is backed up in two ways. One, by a scientist who's very deeply entrenched in the field, and also by the data that they've steered me toward. But I see myself really as a translator. And there is a wide gap between what scientists and doctors know and are working on and what the layperson, those 24 million people with autoimmune disease, understand and have at their access. I hear every day from people who want to learn how to get more data. The average American doesn't know that you can sit down on PubMed and look up an association between organophosphates and multiple sclerosis or something like that. And even if they do, it's very difficult for the majority of people to understand what some of those implications may or may not mean. As you know, with scientific data, things can be misconstrued very easily. So it was really important to me to reflect the work of the scientists with whom I spent those 3 years back and forth interviewing quite diligently, and to put their work forth for a broader audience than it might ever reach if someone weren't to make that step. So I did this really because I am very passionate about this topic, because this is my background as a journalist, is to write about these topics, but to open up a national dialogue.
You first. Wait. You know what? Wait.
Really? Oh, God. I think on her end, the world of nutrition and the world of the medical or rehabilitative side has not merged. And coming from someone with TM and then also being a physical therapist, I have patients come to the office and I give them lots of books like on nutrition. I'm not a nutritionist, but I'll give them books like The Autoimmune Epidemic. I'll give them books on fungus links. I'll give them books on alkaline diets, because I feel like if you can just expose them to some information, it may just help them. And I know I had one patient go, well, one book says one and one says the other. My doctor hasn't mentioned a word of this. And I said, you know what? If you look at the data that we saw today, we're so genetically different. Our environments are so different. How we live our life is so different. If we bought a new car, makes a difference. If we're in that car a lot, it's going to affect our immune system. So that at that moment in time, you may have to drink a really high alkaline water. And then next year, you might find that doesn't do you a damn bit of good. And all of a sudden, you're on a completely different kind of diet. But it's really helpful to know that there's all these little things you can do to help control your symptoms, which I think in a time when you feel very out of control, it's really helpful to have that little bit of control. So on that end, I think it's just because we haven't merged.
You know, I couldn't really hear. If someone could sum it up for me.
Donna,
I couldn't really follow that.
Donna, can you hear me? You were mentioning about the role of stress. We've been zapped with so much information over the last few hours. I wish I hadn't given up science at the age of 16. But I do think that I'd be interested in what research you carried out as to the importance and the effect of stress on these autoimmune conditions. I think it'd be very interesting within the audience today to those who have TM, how many think that stress played a role. You also said that women were more likely, more susceptible to autoimmune diseases. It doesn't surprise me at all. 60 years ago, my mother was very proud to stay at home, bringing up her family. Nowadays, because of the pressures and stresses of life, women not only have to bring up their children, they also have to carry on and pursue careers to bring enough money into their household. They're doing two particular jobs. It doesn't surprise me that they're stressed out. I think that stress is a very major role. Nutrition may be one of the other things, but stress is something I understand. What research did you carry out yourself?
Donna, did you hear that?
I think I heard the question. Was it that what research is showing that stress plays a trigger?
Right.
Is that okay? Well, I would point you toward a book by Dr. Esther Sternberg called The Balance Within. She is one of the top immunologists over at NIH. Probably many of you at the conference know her. And she's written a book called The Balance Within, which is really something that a layperson can read, but is also very much appreciated, I think, by other scientists in the field. And she talks very explicitly about the role of stress in triggering autoimmune disease. There are a number of studies which show the prevalence of stress in triggering autoimmune disease. Probably one of the most famous is that parents who have lost a child, who've had a child who died, are twice as likely to develop MS. And this is a European study. I talked to the authors. I felt that seemed a very high probability to me. So I communicated directly with them when I came across the study. And indeed, that is what they found. So there is a growing body of data. There is a growing body of data about the role of stress in triggering the immune system. I think Doug can speak to this quite a bit. I was very impressed the first time I covered anything that he did, that he stood up there in front of a group of 400 or 500 patients, and he was one of the first scientists who I'd heard who really said to his patients, look, we're looking into how to cure these diseases, but stress and exercise and sleep, they're really playing a big role. And I think he can probably take over because he has some interesting research on stress in the immune system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it plays a role. I think I see that clinically. There is a lot of data. Adam in the back has done a lot of this data on what stress does and cortisol levels and how it alters neurogenesis in the brain, which is a generation of new neurons. So we know that unequivocally to be the case, that more stress hormones, reduced ability of the brain to repair itself. Whether or not daily stresses, somebody driving too damn slow in the left-hand lane is equivalent to that, nobody knows. But and it's impossible. I tell my patients in a joking way, okay, so I need you to get rid of all the stress in your life. All right, well, that's pretty hard to do. But once you think about trying to empower yourself about the disease that you've got and to maximize your function, you can make very explicit choices in ways in which you can reduce stress. You can improve your nutrition. You can improve your exercise. And you can say maybe in toto that's going to help. And I bet you it will. Yeah.
Great. Absolutely.
So I just wanted to chime in. Donna, I'm the head that keeps moving in front of the screen over there. But I just wanted to chime in because this is, as Doug was sort of referencing, falls into the area that I'm doing research with Doug in his lab. And although we don't have the exact ability to back this up with clinical data, I think what is interesting and worth thinking about is that we know that acute stress leads to the release of the stress hormone cortisol. Well, among other things that the stress hormone cortisol does, it is the steroid. Nature thought of it first. And cortisol is the same drug that we now create, in our pharmaceutical companies, which is Solumedrol and prednisone and all of these steroids. So the stress hormone is the same hormone that actually is the brakes for the immune system. And so interestingly, an acute stress, so in MS, for instance, there were 14 studies that looked at the effect of stress on MS. 13 of the 14 showed that stress actually led to a significant increase in the number of lesions and the rates of exacerbations. The one study that didn't show that was a study in Israel during the Scud missile crisis when they were showering Scud missiles. That kind of acute stress over the course of a week when these people were undergoing great stress led to an acute increase in cortisol, and that stress hormone decreased the immune system. So actually stress acutely is not bad. In fact, ironically, that acute stress will lower and dampen the immune system. But the way I think about it, and we do have data that chronic stress, the kind that goes on for weeks to months to years, is the kind of stress that leads to that elevation of cortisol level. And if it's up for too long, then the body says, just as it was described before with the drug that basically kept stimulating that receptor on those cells. That was FTY, I think it was. Yeah, FTY. Basically, the cortisol receptors downregulate and say, oh, I'm not supposed to respond to this anymore. So the analogy, I think, is that cortisol is the brake for the immune system. And if you've been riding that brake, not just overnight or for a week, but you've been riding that brake for weeks and weeks and weeks, then what happens is when you have, I tried to write down all of Alan Rucker's statements, but if you have sort of a confluence of bad happenstance happen all at one time, a number of things happen, then the brake isn't there for you anymore. So I think it is one of the risk factors. It's not that, I wouldn't recommend anybody say, honey, I can't argue with you right now because you're going to worsen my MS. I don't think that that's legitimate. But if you find that you have chronic stress day in and day out, and you're not, the kind of stress that comes from things like depression or just not being able to adapt to circumstances. But I would say also one of my patients the other day said something I thought was worth repeating, which is her family said that they were too busy to help with what was going on with her, and she's now in a wheelchair, and she's in Baltimore getting rehab. And she said, look, you're either busy or you're dead, so that's not a legitimate. We all have stress at all times, but this kind of chronic, unrelenting stress, I think, is a risk factor when you have that elevated cortisol for long periods of time. You've basically been riding your brakes. So just as Doug had said, there are many ways of dealing with stress. Pills are just, better living through popping a pill is not always the right answer. Exercise is a great answer. Biofeedback's a great answer. And I'm sure Donna has other answers for us.
Okay.
That was excellent. That was great. I use the brake analogy in my book, which that was said so perfectly. But when we have that sort of day in, day out cortisol drip that's going through our bodies, we're not able to put that brake on in the way that we need to. And I thought that was all perfectly said. Anything that we can do to bring down that level of day-to-day stress, whether it's whatever exercise we can tolerate, because that's different for every autoimmune disease patient, as we all know, whatever meditation, gentle stretching, yoga, music, whatever it might be, it's been likened to waking up at the beginning of the day and having a backpack on your back that's empty. And the first thing happens is you're late for a doctor's appointment because of traffic, and you put a little bit of stress in that backpack. And then the next thing that happens, you get a call from your office or from a volunteer organization you're working for, and they needed something that you're doing, and they need it in an hour and a half. And then you find out that your son's lacrosse game is canceled, and you're not going to be able to be there to pick him up. And, so on and so forth. And you get home, the chicken that you bought is sitting in the fridge, and you realize that it's gone bad. And all these things stack up, and then what autoimmune disease patients have on top of that that's getting added into that backpack on their back is another factor, and that is the stress of disease itself. And I think any patient who's sitting in that room knows as well as I do that the stress that you carry when you're flaring or you're having symptoms, that fear in and of itself is a terrible stress. And luckily with the care of very good doctors and whatever other ways in which we can ameliorate that stress, I think it's particularly important for patients to be honest about that and to admit that there is a stressor in their lives that comes from some of the physical limitations they may face. Yes, I'd like to go to that conference, for instance. It just kind of came to me. But for whatever reason, I'm not able to do that physically at this moment, or when one isn't feeling well, the stress that comes with that is a little bit different than other people might have in their lives. So you're having to think about stress in a little bit of a different way, and our lives are all stressful. And I have heard people who are in wheelchairs, and I think I caught that this is what he was speaking to a minute ago. I have met people who are in very difficult situations physically, and I hear from thousands of patients, and they're not stressed. They're not. They've found ways to deal with it. so there's some interesting studies that have been done that a lot of people, when they fall ill, they you would think that they are unable to handle the stress of that and that they would be in a much worse situation than some people who have never been sick. But in fact, what they found out was some people who have never been through very chronic and very serious illnesses were carrying higher levels of stress than people who were ill and had learned to deal with it and had learned stress relief. So I kind of want to throw that out to patients because I'm very empathic with what patients are going through and the fact that illness in and of itself can add to your stress level, but ultimately you may find through working through that additional stress in your life that you're able to handle stress maybe in a better way than even some other folks.
Thoughts, comments? Go. Oh.
If it's on. Yeah, there it is. The young researcher brought up pill popping, and we are a society that thinks all of our excuse me, ills can be solved by popping a pill. Did you do any research on the effect that side effects of some of the drugs we are taking have with autoimmune disease? Because I will believe till my dying day that my TM was triggered by inflammation, which was triggered as a side effect to a pill.
Doug, can you repeat that question for me?
Question is, what do you know about the side effects of some of the medicines that we're so accustomed as a society to just taking pills, often
Right.
5, 10, 15 pills at a time, not really aware of the potential interactions of them and whether or not that could contribute to autoimmunity?
I know many patients who are on 15, 20, 25, 30 drugs. I believe that we have pretty good data now about drug combinations. And I think that before any physician prescribes drugs, they're pretty careful to make sure that there are not interactions that are negative. I can't really speak to that because I don't know that we have all the data there is because new drugs are coming out every single day. But I have never yet heard of combinations of drugs causing another autoimmune disease in an autoimmune disease patient. Doug, maybe you want to fill that in for me a little bit. Maybe you know something more than I do.
Well,
I certainly do.
I would say I don't know of a link to autoimmunity, but I would say as a general principle, it's right on that, you know, these drugs are poisons. Now, they're necessary poisons for some of the symptoms that we've got or the diseases that we've got. But the goal really has to be on as few medicines at as low doses as work for the disease and symptoms that we've got. And if there are non-pharmacologic alternatives, like, for example, stretching for spasticity rather than taking loads and loads of baclofen, that's great. If there are natural ways to, for example, a lot of people believe, and I happen to be one of them, that ascorbic acid or vitamin C in cranberry extract can reduce the risk of urinary tract infections rather than going on an antibiotic on a daily basis. Those are the things that are part of this empowerment, where you take as few medicines as you need, because they cause side effects. They cause cognitive slowing, and they cause fatigue, and they cause depression. And now, not to say get off all your medicines, because we need them, but we just have to do it in a very rational, thoughtful way, I think.
Donna?
I would agree with I agree with all of that.
I am an endocrinologist, and I was recently at the Endocrine Society meeting in San Francisco, and one thing became very apparent is that there is another epidemic in the country, and that is vitamin D deficiency.
Right.
This is a hormone, a well-known hormone, and it turns out that vitamin D is a big regulator of the immune system, and a beneficial one. And we have vitamin D deficiency because of two factors. One is cosmetic. That means we use now a lot of sunscreens. And as a result of that, and this is to prevent melanomas, since we use sunscreens, we don't form vitamin D anymore in the skin. There's another epidemic that we have uncovered while measuring vitamin D, and that is there's a lot of gluten enteropathy in the population. And unless we look for the antibodies, because again, that's an autoimmune disorder, we have one way to fight that, and that is to exclude, to consume actually gluten-free diets, which will upregulate our vitamin D levels, and to supplement our diet with vitamin D. What's your thought about that?
I practice all of that. I take a regulated dose of vitamin D every day. I've seen all the research on vitamin D and autoimmune disease, and I think it's probably it's a no-brainer at this point that anyone with an autoimmune disease needs to be talking to their doctor about vitamin D supplementation. We have a terrible vitamin D deficiency. I was interviewing someone a few days ago who's doing some tremendous work on vitamin D and fibromyalgia, and the data just blew me away when he was telling me about it, in his ability to increase patients' functioning with very high doses of vitamin D. Again, you don't want to go giving yourself very high doses of vitamin D because, as Doug pointed out earlier, with drugs are poisons, but certain supplements in very high doses, we know vitamin A, for instance, becomes very toxic to the body in very high doses. Vitamin D, though, the studies are, there's no reason why now you wouldn't be taking a vitamin D supplement. In terms of the gluten avoidance diet, the patients I know who do the best with autoimmune disease are in gluten-free diets. And gluten seems to be very antigenic to the immune system when the immune system is already overtaxed, as it is in patients with autoimmune disease. So we're seeing more and more data coming out on that. I know a scientist who's working on a whole book about gluten-free diets for autoimmune disease patients. I think this is a really exciting time because as I'm listening to the researchers who've gotten up to talk about everything from vitamin D, gluten-free diets, and stress, and slow cortisol drips in the body, we know so much more than we knew even 5 years ago. And it's the work of very brilliant scientists and patients who are willing to get this research and apply it to their own lives. And I see my role in this as trying to explain it to the patients, take the research, translate the research, and give the patients as much information as they can use to make really very healthy choices and take that control back for themselves so that they can get healthier. Because a big part of getting healthy is learning to make choices. I'm going to take vitamin D every day. I'm going to go on a gluten-free diet. I'm going to get a stress reduction habit. I'm going to take a medication maybe that I have to take. But if I do enough of those things over time, it may be that I can lower a dose of a medication or go off of it, again, with a doctor's complete oversight. But that's where we all want to get. We want to get to a place where we're putting this tremendously exciting science that you're hearing about tonight into practical application in our day-to-day lives and using it to empower ourselves so that we can move away from medications and things that do have toxic side effects into a healthier lifestyle. And I see patients doing it every day, and I'm really excited to hear some of the research that we're standing up and talking about tonight, because it's really all about making the patients healthy. And if you think of it as kind of a pointillistic picture where every researcher out there is painting another point, but when we stand back from it, I believe within just a few years' time, we're going to be able to see an impressionistic picture up there, and we're going to understand very well the different things that an autoimmune disease patient needs to do. We haven't had that yet because we haven't put a national focus on these diseases we don't have a national clearinghouse for information for patients in such a way that there is an open forum to exchange information on a layperson level about what's working and what's not working. I certainly hope to see that in the future, because what you're learning just sitting there tonight might change your life.
Okay, I think that's a really good wrap-up. I think this has been a wonderful session. Unless people have any burning issues, we've had an exhausting day, and I think we should probably break for now. Donna, thank you so much for being with us. This was great. So that concludes everything today.